Hey everybody, this is John with another installment of Think Culture. And today I want to talk about history, sort of switch gears a little bit. It's obviously not my normal fare. Generally, I'm talking about political theory or things sort of directly related to political theory. This isn't that. Arnold Toynbee is not a political theorist, although I do think that there are political implications to his thought. And that's a big part of why I'm interested in him. But I'm going to be looking at his book Study of History, the Somerville Abridgment. The original, I think, is the longest work ever written in the English language. So I'm not totally insane. I'm not going to commit myself to that kind of endeavor in terms of thinking about something that's basically my hobby. But Study of History is a meta-historical analysis. He has a cyclical understanding of the historical process from Genesis to Disintegration, and I'm interested in that primarily because I'm interested in decline and the metaphysics of decline specifically. I'm interested in a lot of other thinkers that have sort of similar approaches or conceptions of the historical, such as Heidegger. I'm interested in. He has this idea of sort of the oblivion of being destined through sort of metaphysics as an error. I'll be talking about that eventually. I'll be talking about Vico and his book The New Science eventually. I'll be talking about Spengler, who I think has the sort of most fleshed out, philosophically interesting articulation of cyclical history. But I wanted to start with Toynbee for a variety of reasons. He's the most recent of them. He wrote the most recently, although I think Sorokin, he maybe has sort of a similar model. I haven't read him. I probably will eventually, and if I do, I'll probably talk about him as well. But as far as the ones I've read, Toynbee is the most recent. He was writing Study of History between 1934 and 1961, which is interesting because, we get World War II, for example, which probably has a pretty significant impact on the way that he formulates the model and understands it. But he's sort of less philosophical and less poetic. He has kind of like an Anglo-empiricist orientation to the historical process. And I think that, combined with his conceptual vocabulary and sort of the kind of, I would say, linear structure, sort of, that his model has, I think, lends itself better to being discussed in a video like this. So I think it's a good starting point, although, again, I will talk about these other people later. I think Toynbee is sort of a good foundation for that. And so basically he wants to look at history he wants to be kind of a scientist of history. So he wants to think about it in terms of the laws inherent in the process of history, of civilization, the forces involved in development and disintegration, and he thinks that we can sort of determine what these forces are. We can identify them. We can discover through analogy a kind of cycle that is a consequence of the interaction of all these forces, and through that we can understand something about the trajectory that we're on in the moment that we're in. Although, again, I'm not my interest in cyclical understandings of history isn't primarily the predictive utility. It's I'm interested in kind of the social psychology of decline and moments of decline, because I think that we are in a moment of decline. There are some problems with Toynbee's model. He can't really tell you why disintegration or decline occurs, right? Spengler has an answer to that, basically. Toynbee's answer is kind of like sin. He's very religious. The Christianity really sort of seeps into his writing. And his idea is basically like sin, or the moral failing of the elites that sort of generates collapse, I guess. Another problem is that he can't really tell you about what's unique about various civilizations and why there's a kind of untranslatability between them. Spengler, again, can answer that question. He does so like with the prime symbol idea. So there are things that Spengler does better. There are things that Toynbee doesn't do very well, but there are things I think that Toynbee does better than Spengler as well. And I like I said, I think that it's very interesting and useful to look at his thought and to consider the model that he develops and think about, think about that in terms of analogizing our moment to other historical moments, trying to understand the kind of social forces at work in the social body of the present. When he wrote Study of History, he thought that basically there were 5 living civilizations, right? He thinks that the civilization is the fundamental unit, the actor in the world historical process. So every cycle is the cycle of the development and disintegration of particular civilizations. And he thinks that civilizations are really the actors on the stage of world history. And he thought at the time of his writing that there were still 5 that were alive: Western Christian, Orthodox Christian, Hindu, Islamic, and Far Eastern. And he thought that all throughout history there had been something like 30 civilizations. Some of them, their development was arrested for whatever reason. Some of them were like conquered and had their kind of evolution disrupted in this way, sort of, a kind of fatal interaction with another civilization, etc. But he thought that there were basically about 30. There are more than just the 5 still around today, but these are the 5 that he thought are really developing, that are innovating, that have a role to play in world history. So I'm going to talk about his model, and I'm going to basically leave out all the historical analysis. There's a lot of it, obviously, even though I read the abridged version. It's still, significant. And I think that it, like I said, the good thing about this book is that it lends itself well, I think, to just trying to describe the model and the general chronology of the cycle. And so that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to leave all the historical sort of anecdotes out and just talk about the model. I'm going to try to go in a chronological order. So he thinks that the cycle of a civilization has basically genesis, growth, a time of troubles, a universal state, and disintegration. These are the 5 sort of moments in the life cycle of a civilization. He thinks that, starting with Genesis, you originally have a primitive society. There are tons of them throughout history. Very rarely do they become civilizations. He thinks what differentiates a primitive society from a civilization is not, as some might think, that they don't have institutions. He thinks they do. That they don't have religion. He thinks they do. He thinks they have division of labor, etc. But they're they're smaller. They're fairly static, and we'll see a reason for that shortly. They're technologically less sophisticated. They're less geographically widespread. They're less influential in terms of world history. They don't have any impact, really. And so very rarely do they become civilizations. How do they become civilizations? A cornerstone of his theory, and sort of what he's most known for, is he has this idea of the challenge and response as a vehicle for development. He thinks that a primitive society is faced with a challenge, and these are, at the beginning, these are like physical, geographical challenges. You're on a floodplain, you're trying to figure out how to get food, etc. But the adversary has to appear, a problem has to emerge. If you're in just some sort of Edenic environment, you're not going to develop, you're arrested, right? And if you solve the challenge too well, you're also arrested. What you have to do is sort of solve challenges as they appear to you, but not so much that you become sort of invulnerable to challenge. And you have to not fail to solve it, which would result in your being eliminated. You have to kind of hit this golden mean, this Goldilocks zone. But yeah, the enemy has to appear. I think about this in terms of like Schmidt and the friend-enemy distinction and stuff like that. You have to have an enemy in order to develop as a society, which I think of in fundamentally political terms. But he doesn't necessarily. But I do think that there's an interaction here. But anyway, he thinks that if you meet these sort of challenges successfully, you eventually become a civilization. You develop into a civilization, and as a civilization. Some more general remarks in the way of thinking about this challenge and response process. He has a kind of great man theory of history, like a Thomas Carlyle or something, and he thinks about creative geniuses and their movement of withdrawal and return. That these creative geniuses are the people who solve these challenges and who move society forward thereby. And he says that they're the rare and superhuman souls that through the inward development of personality become capable of creativity in the field of action and grow society. These are the creative geniuses. Collectively as a class, he calls them the creative minority. And they're pushing society forward by solving these challenges. The challenges early on tend to be more macrocosmic. Later on, they become more microcosmic. That means we're moving from challenges like physical, geographical challenges, increasingly toward social problems, psychological difficulties, class struggle, things like that, that are increasingly inward, increasingly about like social psychology, etc. And we have spiritual crisis eventually. But it's the job of the creative minority always to respond to these challenges. In order for society to benefit from the solutions that are devised by the creative minority, however, society, the uncreative majority, they have to look up to, they have to emulate, they have to imitate the creative minority. They have to take up the solutions and allow it to transform society, right? So he says that there's this process of mimesis, and that this is the most basic feature of human beings. So the creative genius, the creative minority, they leave, this withdrawal and return. They leave, they go out into the desert, they come up with some new insight, then they bring it back into the social body, and if it works, then we have imitation, society is transformed, society develops. If it doesn't work, we have esotericism, in which case the insight that they develop, the message that they're delivering to society is too strange, too alien, so it doesn't get taken up. So that's like the deficient mode of mimesis. In the more primitive societies, mimesis is directed back at the ancestors, at traditions, etc. As societies develop, they increasingly direct their mimesis toward the creative minority. They start putting all their eggs in that basket, so to say. And then that turns them, eventually when they turn into a civilization, they're, very directed at the creative minority, and the continued development means increasing mimetic energy directed in that direction, which is part of the problem that leads to collapse, I think. But an additional element here, I think, is pretty interesting to this challenge and response mimesis process, and that's this concept of etherealization that he has. And etherealization, he thinks that in societal development, as progressively you integrate the successful responses of the creative minority to challenges in society, what this looks like is a process of etherealization. And the way he understands that is kind of like efficiency, rationalization, increasing abstraction, fluidization. This tracks with some of this movement from the macrocosm to the microcosm in terms of problems generally. But there's this interesting element of it. Like he talks about telephones, for example. They used to have these big telegraphy wires. Now, obviously, we have cell phones, right? So it used to be like you'd have to talk to an operator. They would direct you to someone. This is a bulky, slow process. Not everyone has access to it. It takes up a lot of physical space with these wires and these telephone poles, etc. Now we have cell phones. Everyone has their own. They're faster. They do all these other functions. People are constantly connected to each other all the time. He talks about it the same way with like a train, for example. Early on, they're on one track. Lots of people have to load into them. They're slow and solid. Everyone has to go to the same place, so like mobility is kind of limited. Then eventually you get personal cars and the highway system. Now everyone's going all directions all the time, different speeds. Everyone, he thinks of this process as like etherealization, which is interesting to me. I tend to think about it like Virilio, like the kind of concept of dromology. Like civilization is about speed, the development of a civilization is about faster and faster all the time, more mobility, more fluidity and constant transformations, which again makes sense as you direct more mimesis to the creative minority and less at tradition, ancestors, etc. The rate of change is going to speed up dramatically. But in this way, a primitive society develops into a full-fledged civilization. It becomes a real actor on the stage of world history, but eventually the process hits a snag. It has always hit a snag for every civilization which has ever existed, and you get what's called a time of troubles. So we had Genesis, we had growth, now we're having time of troubles. That's the new phase that we're in. And this is when the process of disintegration really begins. It's a period of strife, of discord, of breakdown in the institutions and norms, of disunity, and his only real explanation for it, like I said, is just sort of is moral. It's the creative minority becomes sort of prideful, lazy, they fall into sin, etc., which is a big problem because all the mimesis is directed at them. And consequently, they cease to really be either creative or to merit the admiration that they did before. People used to love them, adore them, try to be like them. So they had all this social privilege and they deserved it. Now they don't deserve it, but they don't want to give up their social position. So they have to rely on force or subterfuge rather than on people following them and accepting their superiority willingly. So in this way, they cease to be the creative minority anymore at all. They lose their creativity, and they become the dominant minority. And this inaugurates, for Toynbee, an era of class conflict. He doesn't think, like Marx does, that class conflict is a historical universal. He thinks class conflict only appears when the disintegration of a society begins, with its time of troubles. And they begin their descent into complete disintegration. We get, at this time, a schism in the body social, a schism in the soul. We get a loss of social unity, and later the universal state will attempt to fix this. I'll talk about that in a second. So class conflict now starts to emerge, and it occurs basically between three classes. The dominant minority, newly developed out of the creative minority. The internal proletariat, who are starting to feel alienated from society. It's sort of, they're in but not of society. They oppose society. They feel like a society opposes them. And then the external proletariat. These are the three classes. The external proletariat are people sort of on the border of the civilization, right outside the border of the civilization. They're like the barbarians, basically. And so we break down into these three classes. Whereas before, creative individuals, the creative geniuses, they led society. Now, and they do that through their victorious responses to challenges. Now they become the dominant minority. They try to impose their rule by force. And they actually start to become, he says, increasingly proletarianized. They get vulgarized through imitation of the internal proletariat. So they start to direct mimesis back at the internal proletariat, and they also direct it at the external proletariat, and they start to get barbarized. They pick up the habits and customs of both these different groups, and so their character, their sort of psychological character as a class, starts to be proletarianized themselves. The external proletariat, who used to sort of be interested in the civilization. They wanted to immigrate into it. They wanted to assimilate it into it. They admired the creative minority. They were influenced by them, etc. Now that stops, and they start focusing just on their own identity. And so the border between these civilizations hardens up. It used to be a kind of frontier zone, a kind of a liminal space. He calls it a limen, and it was like a zone of influence, and it was constantly shifting as civilizations grow and develop. The border sort of gets pushed, out into the world because they're always expanding. At this time, the border starts to freeze up. It eventually becomes rigid. It gets militarized. It becomes what he calls a limes, and but this is a sort of stopgap measure. He thinks that eventually, once the border stops going forward and you try to freeze it in place, it actually starts coming back. Eventually, when you totally disintegrate, it's pushed back all the way into you, and the barbarians sort of sweep all your pieces off the board, as it were. So in addition to this, that's it gets pushed back. Also, it's important to understand through suicide. He thinks that no civilization is murdered; all civilizations commit suicide, and it's just sort of once you've killed yourself, then the external proletariat comes and sweeps your body off the street or whatever. Like I said, the internal proletariat, they're becoming increasingly alienated, disenfranchised. They grow increasingly uneasy and hostile, and they're looking basically for a way out of the civilization. They're tired of it. They want to drop out. But this process of disintegration that begins with the time of troubles is not just a steady, continuous descent into full disintegration. He says that it's a process that consists of routes and rallies. There's a kind of ebb and flow to the movement. And he says sometimes saving moves are made, but they're always temporary. For example, the universal state, which I hinted at earlier, this is an institution that in the process of disintegration, the dominant minority creates. It creates it to try to get out of the time of troubles. And this is sort of their last exercise of real creativity, and they're trying to stave off disintegration. It's a rally in terms of these routes and rallies. So you get the time of troubles, and then you get the universal state as an escape from them, but it's always kind of a false escape. It seems like it helped. Order is sort of restored. Complete disintegration is kept at bay. But this salvation is always very short-lived. He thinks the Roman Empire, for example, is sort of the prototypical universal state. And this is an attempt to unify society in the face of all the social and psychological schisms that are occurring in the time of troubles, and which in some form persist. So it happens through sheer political will, because this is the dominant minority. They're exercising their authority to really, try to hold society together in one last desperate act. And it's not going to happen. But they do it through sheer political will. So the universal state, in terms of its features, it's sort of censorious. Things are being standardized. They're drained of any artistic and intellectual vitality. Rules become sort of more oppressive, and the force is applied. In the growth phase, we saw increasing differentiation, diversity, transformation. That's what it means to get this sort of increase in the potency and the mimetic power, persuasiveness of the creative minority. As their place in society increases, society starts to differentiate itself increasingly. During the universal state, we get indifferentiation, we get standardization, we get sort of boredom and a lack of creativity. Maybe what he calls an Indian summer, or a false renewal. During this time, the internal proletariat is also engaged in their final act of creation, theirs being the universal church. And this is a sort of parallel institution. The dominant minority creates the universal state, the internal proletariat, they create the universal church. And these are sort of higher religions. Toynbee thinks the whole purpose of the process of civilization is the creation of these universal churches. They're sort of the purified forms of the civilization. They preserve everything that's good about society, and they eliminate what isn't. They're a legacy, the legacy of the civilization for the future is preserved, and may sort of help in the formation of a new civilization as well. He thinks that the universal church emerging from the internal proletariat in our own time, and remember he writes this from 34 to 62, something like that. He thinks that it's Marxism. That's the new universal church of the internal proletariat. I think that's a pretty good guess for that time, but that actually Marxism hadn't fully developed into the kind of wokest ideology that we now see, and that's actually the universal church, I would say. And so the third institution, in parallel to the universal state and the universal church, is sort of the heroic age, the golden age of the barbarians, their mythic period, where they prove themselves and their might fighting against this dying behemoth, that had been once towering and glorious and is now reduced to ash and pity. They fight against the civilization, they crush it because it's committed suicide, and that's their institution. It's the sort of golden age, right? And then they form the basis of a new possible civilization. During this period, like I said, this long period of disintegration in general, there's a schism in the social body, and there's also, which is class conflict, that's how it emerges, and there's also spiritual schism, he says. And he describes some of the features and symptoms of that spiritual or psychological crisis. And I think that these are really interesting. Like I said, this is the stuff that I'm interested in terms of decline. And basically what that means is along all these different axes, a schism occurs in which, like the first one, for example, is creativity. There's a schism, and it gets separated off into an active and a passive version. So there are active and passive substitutes for whatever is lost, for whatever is subject to the schism, right? And there's a bunch of different axes along which this occurs. So like I said, the first one is creativity. The creative impulse breaks down into two substitutes. The active one is self-control, which is where the would-be creators, they attempt to create through self-discipline, through the taming of the passions, taking control over their life, their habits, triumph over nature and the natural tendencies of ourselves. They cease to be creative, and they try to hold on in some sense to a kind of creativity and exercise creativity through immense self-control. That's their replacement. Then the passive version is abandon, which is the opposite of that, where you let go, you indulge in everything that you desire, you allow your impulses and your aversions to kind of have full reign, you let nature express itself. And through self-control or abandon, these both of these are creatives trying to restore creativity to society, to their lives, but they do it in one of these sort of halfways. As a substitute for mimesis, we get the active version, which is martyrdom, where you die for the principle, you die for your leaders, you die for an ideal or a way of life or your civilization, and you think that your total devotion to it, your total uncritical, unthinking devotion, you think that somehow proves that it's still worthwhile, it still has validity. The passive version is truancy, in which you're shirking your duty, you don't care, you owe no allegiance to your ideal or way of life or civilization. You abandon your generals and fellow soldiers on the battlefield, and you're just looking out for number one, right? You're truant in your duty. In terms of a sense of what's happening in the world, where people had been sort of fine and excited about the future and things are developing and we're getting stronger, whatever. Now we get, that separates off into the active version, which is sin, and people think that we're having disintegration because of, as he says, the moral defeat which desolates the routed soul is felt as a result of personal or societal failure. So these are people who think that disintegration is sort of our fault, or my fault, your fault. We've done bad things. We've been evil. We've allowed ourselves to become wicked or whatever, and that's why everything is collapsing around us. The passive version is drift, where these people just sort of feel like it's fate or a random chance. It's irrational. There's nothing you can do about it. Things fall apart. No one's at fault. And we don't have control over anything. That's the drift sense. In terms of the style of creation, like the genre of an art, or the form that creation takes, the modus operandi of the creatives, the elan vital, what we get is, on the one hand, people obsessed with sort of the universal or the eternal. They think there's a absolutely correct way of doing things, of creating some perfect formulation that everyone has to master, in which brooks no deviation. This is the correct. This is how something that's beautiful looks, and there's nothing it can't be changed. The formula is perfect, right? On the other hand, you get the passive version, which is just sort of the melting pot. It's syncretism. It's just like pick and choose from everywhere, willy-nilly, as it pleases. Take from everyone, combine them however you'd like, learn from everything, and just mix it all together in one big stew. This is how a lot of things in academia, in philosophy, for example, I would say that this is sort of the dominant approach. And people think that it's really original and creative, but as Toynbee says, it's a symptom of a schism in our creative formula, right? It's a symptom of the fact that we have lost our creativity. We've lost our ability to innovate and create new styles, so we're just sort of endlessly repeating and combining everything else. Now, more broadly, he has, as we talked about, there's this idea of the growth of civilization has a kind of movement from the macrocosm to the microcosm, right? And the creative genius withdraws from the macrocosm into the microcosm and learns something and tries to reproduce it at the macrocosmic level. Now, he says there's a kind of double schism that happens with respect to this movement of the creative types. In the attempt to go from macrocosm to microcosm, now this is broken down, and he says there's a violent active and passive, and there's also a gentle active and passive. In terms of the violent pair, we get archaism and futurism. Archaism being violent passive, futurism being violent active. And he thinks basically they're both sort of revolutionary. They both constitute a kind of rejection of the macrocosmic and a displacement along its temporal axis, right? They want to live in the microcosm instead of the macrocosm, at least in its present formulation. With archaism, people want to go back into the past as an imagined utopian macrocosm. It even constitutes, I think, a kind of reversion in the mimetic process, where mimesis again becomes directed at ancestors and tradition, etc. Futurism, on the other hand, they reject the present macrocosm as well, and they want to substitute it for an imagined future utopian macrocosm, something which hasn't occurred yet. So it's very different than the archaist version in that sense. While the archaist directs mimesis at the ancestors, the futurist rejects mimesis totally. Consequently, Toynbee thinks that futurism is actually much more totalitarian. He even calls it satanic. And I think that's an appropriate way of describing it. Sloterdijk and Spheres, again, which I'll talk about later, there are actually strong parallels to this. He thinks he has his own concept of like the demonic and the Luciferian, right? And I think that there are a lot of parallels to it. It's very similar. So I'm going to try to remember this and point it out whenever I do Spheres. But yeah, Toynbee thinks the futurist is especially bad. He says of it, In the political sphere, futurism may express itself either geographically in the deliberate obliteration of existing landmarks and boundaries, or socially in the forcible dissolution of existing corporations, parties, or sects, or in the liquidation of whole classes of society. Obviously, this draws a lot of parallels to the kind of stuff we're seeing in the streets today. But yeah, he does think that the archaist and the futurist, they're both violent. They both are idealistic and eventually have to turn into swordsmen. They have to turn to the sword to enforce their idealism. But he thinks the archaist is sort of not as bad. And he thinks that the archaist actually ultimately serves the purposes of the futurist. Because through trying to perpetuate an anachronism, which is doomed to fail, and it's avoidance of innovation, he leaves the door open to the kind of ruthless innovation of the futurist, who then is prepared to come in and wipe everything away and create a new world. But there are gentle versions as well. One of them is detachment. That's the passive version. And this is sort of like withdrawal. Like in terms of the withdrawal and return, detachment is withdrawal. It's like Stoicism or maybe Zen Buddhism or something, about abolishing attachments, not being overly invested, going with the flow. So it's a kind of withdrawal that doesn't have return. It's just withdrawal. It doesn't reject the macrosphere and want to force it into some other mold, former or imagined future mold. It doesn't want to do anything with the macrosphere. It just wants to exit. The creative here, they withdraw into the desert, and then they just say, screw it, I don't want to go back at all. Now the active version does come back, and this is how he thinks that the withdrawal and return movement can repeat itself, and we can get palingenesia, a second birth of the civilization. So Spengler is a fatalist. He thinks that civilizations die, they have an organic life cycle, there's nothing you can do about it, optimism is cowardice. Toynbee thinks that it can be saved, and that it's saved through this active, this gentle active version that he calls transfiguration, although it's never happened before. But it's a second birth. It's what we might say in Heideggerian terms, it's like the new beginning, right? But so these four, archaism, futurism, detachment, transfiguration, these are all people who are trying to be saviors. They're trying to save society. They're attempted saviors. I think he thinks they all come from the dominant minority also. But they all aim to save society, and the only one that he thinks can is the transfigurator, the prophet, God incarnate. Like in the Der Spiegel interview, Heidegger saying only a God can save us. Toynbee agrees, and this is the transfigurator who he thinks can appear on the world historical stage and rescue a dying civilization. But anyway, that's sort of the cycle, from primitive societies to founding empires, from anarchy to aristocracy to democracy to monarchy, and what Spengler called Caesarism, and then back into anarchy again. But he isn't a fatalist. This is very important to understand. He maintains some optimism. He says, if we are to try to look into our future, we may begin by reminding ourselves that though all other civilizations whose history is known to us may either be dead or dying, a civilization is not like an animal organism, obviously a reference to Spengler, condemned by an inexorable destiny to die after traversing a predestined life curve. There is no known law of historical determinism, remember he's all about finding these laws and these forces and stuff, that compels us to leap out of the intolerable frying pan of our time of troubles, which he thought we were in when he wrote this, but he didn't think we had quite developed into the period of the universal state, and into the slow and steady fire of the universal state, where we shall in due course be reduced to dust and ashes. So yeah, that's Toynbee. That's his model. I hope that was very interesting and you got something out of it. Remember, don't simply react, but think culture.